Lifestyles with Tia podcast, and it was titled Under Shone Like the Sun Through Darkness.
Thanks for having me today. I think any kid thinks that they have a typical childhood because it doesn't resonate when you're little that you're in a situation in any different than your neighbors. You know, I think that when I started to get a little bit, I would say around 7 or 8, I realized that my mother was living in a lesbian relationship. And then I think I was around 8 years old when I realized that my, I call her my stepmom, my mom's girlfriend, was an alcoholic. The first time I saw her drunk, I was terrified. I thought that she was, I guess I didn't know the word stroke at the time, but that's how it looked. It looked as if she was having a medical emergency because she couldn't stand and her speech was all slurred. And I was absolutely terrified because in our home, she was the leader, she was the strong one, she was the one that got everything done and domineering and in control. And so that was the first time that I saw her completely out of control. And that terrified me. And so that really shook my world. Later on, my mother told me that she had a terrible time with alcoholism. I personally wasn't getting hit, but my mother and my sister were. It was severe. I feel like it was like at least once a week there was a horrible, angry meltdown happening in my home, and I would just go hide in my room. Basically, I would take my dog and hide in my room. So it was very tumultuous.
How long after your mother got a divorce from your father was this happening?
My mom actually hung out with her girlfriend in high school. Her girlfriend and my biological father actually hung out in the same group of friends. What happened was my mom had my sister and I, and then it was kind of a shotgun wedding, as they call it. My grandmother basically said, this is so sad to repeat this, but I think it'd be important for the listeners to hear this, that, this was a situation where it was the mid 70s, and the case of matter was that my mom was pregnant out of wedlock. And so my grandmother basically said, you're going to have an abortion, or we're going to move, or you're going to marry the guy. Those are the three choices. And my mother was like, okay, I'll marry him. And I think they were probably only married maybe max a year before they got divorced, because he was abusing drugs and selling drugs, and he went to jail somewhere in there. The timeline is foggy for me in that respect because our family doesn't share that kind of information. Basically, this is stuff that I picked up and pieced together over the years. And then my mother ended up working at the same bar as this chum that she had in high school. And the next thing, over time, they started dating, and then they moved in together. And so I was 3 years old when that happened. And so my mom was living in the lesbian relationship from until I was 11. And so that's a long time. And so during that time, I had actually asked my mom, is she a girl or a boy at one point? And I was like, I think 6 years old, where I was kind of like trying to grapple with, wait a second, there's something confusing happening here where she looks like a woman, but then she's acting like a man. And then, I was just a little girl, and I asked it in all innocence. And that just goes to show, no one ever said, that this was wrong or anything, but in my mind, there was no continuity there. It's just like, how do those two ideas merge together in my mind? I didn't get it. I just knew that wasn't natural, I guess would be the best way to put it. And then obviously, the domestic abuse was wrong, and no one was saying that was wrong, but I guess what I'm trying to say is there's absolute truth, and I want to emphasize that throughout our whole conversation, that even a small child can tell what's right and what's wrong. And I think that's a sign that points clearly that there is a God. I think that there's some people who want to define it as I'm heterosexual or homosexual, and really God created us all to be heterosexual. That's my view now, but I think that if we are without God, I think that we can just allow ourselves to go in any direction at all whatsoever, which is obviously extremely unhealthy. God created us a certain way in order for us to have the most functional, healthy life possible. Since he's a creator, he ought to know how, a best possible life could be. And so, unfortunately, my mother just chose to be with whoever, whenever, however. And that's really, unfortunately, was a bad role model. But I feel that her mindset was to live in the moment, to live for her own enjoyment, and that was pretty much the end of that. And unfortunately, but she had me when she was 18, so I think, all fairness to say, there was a lot of, and her father died at that time in her life, so my heart just goes out to her, as just a lot of hardship and severe pain can cause devastation and loss of identity.
So what happens after? Do they break up or?
Yes, they did, and they parted ways, and mostly it was due to the fact that my stepmom wanted to pursue a degree in lab testing. It's a very good career, and it pays very well, and so it's kind of in the medical field. And she had to go to another town that was an hour or two away in order to get this degree. And my mom just chose to remain in the town that we were in and did not choose to move with her. And even though that was a dramatic loss emotionally and financially for our family, because she was obviously, we're all obviously very attached to her, because we did have a lot of good times too. There was just this huge relief after she was gone, because the fighting just stopped. Yeah, it was just this huge, it was like letting the air out of a balloon. Honestly, my mom, she's a very diminutive person. She's like only 5 foot 1 inches tall, and probably weighed about, 135, 140, she was a small person, and then her girlfriend was like practically 6 feet tall, probably weighed like 185, somewhere in there. So their size difference also, it was just easy for my stepmom to domineer, like physically and verbally, over her. And that threat was gone. So it was a huge relief. So there was about 2 years there where my mom was single, and I love that, even though we were, a lot poorer. It was it was a break from all the drama and abuse. So
One day you wake up to see this man sitting in your living room.
right, that was a big shock, because honestly, I brought up probably maybe a couple times, I can count on one hand, when I asked about my father to my mom. And I just remember being at around probably 8 or 9, and she just shut me down with the answer, "He's a terrible man, forget about it." I only had seen like a couple pictures of him when he was in his teens, when I was a little baby. So I really didn't know anything about him other than the fact that my mom said he was a bad guy. One night after my 13th birthday, I had a fantastic birthday party. I heard a voice in the next room, and my bedroom wall shared a wall with the living room, and I could hear a man's voice in there, and I thought, that's weird. And I could hear his voice and his mannerisms, and actually reminded me a lot of my grandmother, which is his, and I mean my dad's mom, because when I listened, I could hear the manner of speech was very similar to her. And I started thinking, I think that might be my dad. And I went out there, and there was no introduction, nothing. It was so strange, Tia. I just came out there, and he was just in mid story. He's a fantastic storyteller. He's a really funny guy. And so I pretty much just pulled up a chair and just listened to
Uh,
all the adventures he'd been on.
wow.
And just, he had traveled across the country hitchhiking. He's, just a hippie, just a young guy.
So do you think they were in contact with each other before he showed up to the house, or you think it was just kind of like, oh, they came across each other by chance?
Yeah. I still wonder that, Tia. I really don't know. Just the way it went down just felt like he might have given her like a midnight phone call or something. That just is the vibe I'm getting, because he's very last minute. He doesn't plan anything. He's just live for the moment, kind of spontaneous kind of guy. So I don't see any planning happening there with the two of them. I think that she just heard his voice, and I think her knees buckled and she just said, "Here's my address, come on over." I mean, that's how it felt. So
So since there was no proper introduction, do you think like you knew by heart that was your father, or they did eventually tell you that that was your father?
that's a good question. I no one's ever asked me that before. I'm sure that must have been said at some point.
Naturally fell into its place and you guys became a family again.
Yeah, it felt awkward for me though. Honestly, I was very uncomfortable having a man in the house because I wasn't used to men in any realm. And when you're a grade school kid, you only have female teachers. I at that point in my life had just my first male teacher. The current at that moment was my sixth grade teacher, and he was upstanding, a great guy. But honestly, I still felt very standoffish around men. So this was all a new impression for me. This was all new territory, and it felt kind of angsty, to be honest.
Things started falling apart, and that's when the secrets started happening. What kind of secrets were they?
Well, the first thing that happened was I didn't see anything odd going on really, but then she would go to work and like his work wasn't very consistent. That was the first thing I noticed. I felt like he got a job, but then it felt like he only worked 2 or 3 times a week. I might be wrong on that, but the kind of jobs he got were like construction or working at a gas station, or some of the jobs he did didn't last very long. And so he was hanging around the house a lot more than a working man should be.
Yeah.
And so one day he's like, I'm doing a little bit of drugs on the side. It's just pot, it's no big deal. But don't tell your mom, she'll freak out. That just immediately felt awkward.
Mhm.
And then and then he started giving me compliments,
Mm.
really inappropriate compliments, probably once or twice a week.
He decides to leave the house after that, or he moves you guys to another state because of his new job.
Right.
Oh,
So his job situation had always been iffy at best. But thankfully, for my sake, for a while there, it was 2 years of junior high before we moved to another state. And so he was there off and on. He kept burning himself out of jobs, which was a blessing to our family because he would just send the money to us, apparently, and he would be gone because he was working in another town. So that's a pinnacle that I need to share because that's when I finally got the courage, Tia, to share with my mom what was going on. And so she would constantly back him up no matter what. So I would say, Mom, what's going on with dad? Is he coming back? Of course, I was praying he wouldn't because I was terrified of him coming home. And she'd say, "Oh, he's working hard in another town and he's sending the money to us. And pretty soon we'll all be together again." And I would say, "Mom, you don't know what he's done. I don't want him to come back. I'm afraid." And she says, "Oh, don't be so terrible. He's trying, he's new to this whole dad thing." And I'd say, "Mom, you don't know what he's done." And so after a lot of that kind of talk, it was, I would say, probably 2 or 3 weeks of that, Tia. And some of those times he would come back and then he would be gone for another week. I finally, face to face with my mom, we were at the dining room table. Again, I remember this like it was yesterday. Very clearly, I said, "Mom, he's coming into my room. He's touching me." And honestly, Tia, I could not say anything more than that.
mhm.
I pray that I had the courage to tell her about all the compliments and like how much, and how, overpowering he was. I pray that I made that clear. But either way, coming into my room and touching me, I mean, that's enough to
That should have been
freeze.
enough. Yeah.
That should be enough to scare the crap out of any mom. Hold the mustard right there. Stop what's going on. What did you just say? No, it was none of that. It was just, well, he probably didn't know it was you because he was drunk. He probably thought it was someone else, honey. He didn't mean to do it. And that was a barrage of excuses,
Mhm.
of covering him, of having his back, and completely shutting me out.
Yeah.
So that blew my world up
Yeah.
because here was the person that I confided in my entire life, the person I trusted the most,
Mhm.
and that rug got yanked out from under me. And I have to say that that was more devastating than
Yeah.
the abuse that my dad was heaping on me. That just shook my world. And a week or two later, he comes home and says, "We're moving to Florida." And I thought to myself, "Oh my gosh, I don't want to go to a new town with him. All my friends are here.
Mhm.
And I was a soccer coach, and I ref soccer, and I was involved with like a city choir. I had all my clubs and friends. Tia, I spent as much time away from home as I could, involved in these clubs, hanging
Yeah.
out with my friends. If all that got taken away, I knew that I'd be around him more. At the last minute, he said, "We're moving to another state very far north." And I know I wrote that in my book, but I just don't feel really comfortable sharing that right now, just for anonymity's sake. Um, it just was devastating when I found out at the last minute that we were going to move to another state far north. And then he also emphasized, "And don't tell anyone." To be homeschooled, to be homesteading out in the middle of nowhere with this guy who's just a total disaster. Even at his lowest point, my heart is broken for him.
Of course.
It's broken for him because he honestly, and I want to emphasize this to the listeners too, he would apologize to me after he had those big meltdowns and would attack my mom, believe it or not. And so I just want everyone to hear that, who's listening to this today or who will, because listen, even if they apologize, if they can't stop abusing, if they can't stop attacking people, even if they're sorry, well, good. I'm glad you're sorry. That's the beginning of some healing. But that person needs to not still be in your life right now until they can get that under control. And so, even though I saw that he was sorry and I appreciated that, at the same time, it would just be 2 or 3 days later and he was attacking my mom or sister again. I remember the day that my mom and dad sat my sister and I down. We'd gotten pretty settled there. I would say it was probably 2 or 3 weeks in of our move. And they said, "Listen, guys, we don't have any money to give you any of your basic needs. So you guys need to go get jobs. Okay, so we can't buy you school supplies, school clothes, nothing. So if you want anything, you have to get jobs." And I just was indifferent to that idea. I didn't know what a huge blessing that was going to be. When
Yeah.
we got there, we got to went to a hotel. I don't know if that was my parents' idea or what, but we got to this hotel. We went in there. It was beautiful. It had plush, thick carpet. It was warm. And I started figuring out, Tia, that I was going to have one warm meal a day. So, long story short, we got work permits and we got to work. We got to work Saturday and Sunday. We had public toilets and free restaurant lunch. And so we would they would take our orders. We could eat whatever we wanted. And we got to sit in that restaurant. There were no people there during that time when we ate, but it was beautiful. I love that job. And it was a sanity for me. I got to get away from my dad. I had heat, I had plumbing, I had food. I was in seventh heaven.
You befriended a boy, and
Yeah.
he became your good friend. And he
Yes.
was one friend that you started sharing what was
Yeah.
happening in the home with.
Exactly. He was very intuitive. He started figuring things out. I think that, I was trying to hide the fact that I was homeless by as soon as I got to school, I'd run in the bathroom, go to the bathroom, obviously, since I didn't have a toilet. So I did that right away because I'd always have horrible stomach aches because I'd have to hold my pee forever. My hair, I could only wash it once a week. So, how good did I look? I mean, I'm sure he figured out that I was extremely poor. It is horrific. And the way I'm living is horrible. And I needed to own that, and that was good. So that night, the last thing he said that day, it was the beginning of a new beginning by him saying that, because he said, "Look, if you ever need to call me," he goes, "do not hesitate. Do not hesitate." On a side note, I want to mention and emphasize I think this would shock people, but they need to hear it, is that I'm pretty sure, well, actually, I looked up the symptoms that I had scurvy, severe scurvy, because of my eating was horrible. And I don't know if you know anything about it. It's not a very common modern disease, especially in a first world nation. And third world nations or sailors back in the day was a common thing that they would get from not eating enough fruits and vegetables. But my buttocks and my thighs and then my scalp had open sores galore, and my bottom and my back of my legs, it was like raw hamburger. I mean, I know that sounds really nasty, but I just want people to understand the severity of my malnutrition. I was ill that day and I had scurvy, and I was just wearing these tattered, torn up clothes, this pathetic winter coat. At this point, I did have Sorel boots. I don't know why, but they didn't fit properly. So I'd been wearing them about a month, and I was walking with my feet like this, just on tiptoes, because they had scraped up the back of my heels so bad that my heels were constantly bleeding,
Mhm.
like all the time. And I had them wrapped in paper towels. And I remember trying to tell my mom that, but no one would do anything. So whenever I was wearing those boots, because all I had were those canvas shoes otherwise in the snow. So that day I walked out of there wearing those boots that made my heels bleed. I had scarring on my heels for probably 10 years from that, by the way. A blessing happened for me, and I got moved to a new foster home out in the country. And I met this beautiful woman who changed my life forever. She was not what by the world would say a beautiful woman, but because she had the love of Christ in a huge way in her life, she shone and she was so beautiful. I was captivated by her right away. And she said, "Well, honey, I'm so glad you're here. I can't wait to, I mean, just her whole presentation was, I want you. I'm so glad you're here." That was so new to me. I never felt so welcome as I did in her home. And she, after a while, said, "Would you like to come to church with me?" And I thought, well, why not? And so I went to church, and there was a lot more people like her there. And so of course I wanted to go back every weekend. And when there was an announcement that there was going to be a week-long revival, I said, I definitely want to go. And I could tell that Bonnie was very pleased. All I could say was, I want to believe, I want to believe, I want to believe. And then the church started fading away right before my eyes. And it blurred out to where all of a sudden I was back in the foster home out in the country. And it seemed like it was morning, because I was in bed and I was sitting up looking around confused, like, how did I get here? Why am I here? And what is going on? Because I could feel everything. I want to emphasize that to the people who are listening. I could feel that I was sitting in the bed. I could feel the fabric of the sheets. And I ran out and I went down the steps, ran through the living room, ran through the kitchen. I remember feeling the different texture on the floor when I ran in the kitchen. I grabbed the doorknob. I remember touching the cold doorknob on my hand. I pulled it open. And when I pulled it open, these trumpets, clear as can be, this beautiful sound washed over me. And I stepped outside and I looked up in the sky and I stepped in the snow. I remember that. I had no socks or shoes on, the bare feet. And I looked up and I saw the clouds, and it was a bright sun streaming through them. And there were two angels playing these beautiful trumpet sounds. And I saw a man in white, and all in white, and his face shone like the sun. And he came down, and it came down through the sky, and the music is playing and playing. And he came down and he stood right in front of me, and he wrapped his arms around me. And I looked up, and all I could see was his shining face. I couldn't even see his face. It was shining like the sun. And I was being embraced by the man of light, and I knew it was Jesus. And I said, I believe, I believe, I believe. And I saw him fade away. And I saw the church come back into view. And I was back at the church again. And I was like, what is going on?
So this is during the sermon.
Honestly, Tia, I don't even know if the sermon was over because I didn't hear anything. I was just so excited. I ran up there, and I remember him smiling at me, shaking my hand, patting me on the back. His wife, She hugged me. His kids were smiling. Everyone was smiling. And then all the next thing I know, I'm walking out into the parking lot with my foster mom's son, because he was the one, him and his beautiful wife were the ones that took me every night. And they drove me all the way home. And I was just staring out the window going, I believe, I believe. And then I got home, and Bonnie always watched all these little children. Besides having three foster kids in her home, she was always giving and so generous. She was sitting in a chair, and I ran in there and I touched her hand, and she turned and her faced me with her shining face. And I said, I believe. And she said, that's so good. It was the moment to see her face that she knew that I was saved. And that moment, she patted my hand and she squeezed my hand and she said, that's so good. That's so good, sweetie. And that was the beginning of the rest of my life, because that hole that was in my heart, it literally filled up. Like, it felt like I had a real hole there before. I don't know if that makes sense, but it was filled up and overflowing with joy. And even though I moved, well, let's see, 9 more times after that,
Yeah.
I did end up in a Christian group home a lot of moves later. And that was the longest placement I ever was. It was a year. It was Alaska Baptist Children's Services. And they picked up where Bonnie left off with nurturing me in the Word of God and learning, all the beautiful hymns and the fellowship and youth group and the church. And I met my future husband at that high school when I moved into the big city. And just my life just kept getting better and better. I mean, there was a ton of rocky times, and I wrote all that in my book. And if anyone ever wants to read that, it's out there. But that was the beginning of all good things.
I'm just so thankful that you shared your story with us on TV.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Tia. It was such a blessing to be with you today. Thank you for having me.